Okay, let's unpack this. We are embarking on a deep dive today into a life so rich with cultural, political, and personal controversy that it genuinely defies any easy definition.
It really
The
does.
subject is known universally by just two initials, BB. We are, of course, talking about Brigitte Bardot.
And when you dive into the source material for Brigitte Bardot,
Hmm.
you quickly realize you're not just looking at the career of a successful actress. I mean, not at all.
No.
You're charting the trajectory of a massive, almost uncontrollable cultural phenomenon. She was this revolutionary force, a lightning rod for post-war societal change in the 50s and 60s.
Absolutely.
But then she's spent the entire second half of her life using that immense celebrity capital in ways that are often, profoundly challenging, legally contentious, and frankly, very isolating.
Right. And that's our mission today, to gain a really thorough understanding of these two radically conflicting phases of her life. We need to follow the path from the electrifying screen icon, that period between, 1952 and her retirement in 73, and connect it directly to the fiercely dedicated, sometimes legally troubled animal rights warrior she became from 1973 all the way to the present day.
And the sources for this are really comprehensive. They give us a full biographical profile detailing her early, very rigid life, her groundbreaking filmography, all those complicated personal relationships, and of course, the numerous legal battles that have really defined her later years.
If we frame her entire existence as a study in pure contradiction,
Yeah.
it's just spectacular. I mean, how does the woman who the French philosopher Simone de Beauvoir called locomotive of women's history,
Your locomotive.
the absolute symbol of sexual freedom, how does she become a figure who's been fined 6 times by French courts for inciting racial hatred?
It's an incredible pivot.
And how does she manage that while at the same time earning global accolades, including PETA awards and recognition from the UN, for her unwavering, all-consuming fight for animals?
It's a huge psychological tightrope walk. And we have to remember, she wasn't just a global star. For a time, she was basically a French diplomatic tool.
You're talking about the de Gaulle quote.
Exactly. President Charles de Gaulle famously observed that Bardot was a French export as important as Renault cars. I mean, think about that. She was national branding.
Wow.
So to understand the gravity of her defiance later in life, we first have to understand the rigidity of the world she was defying. So let's start right at the beginning.
Okay, so the story of Brigitte Bardot is often presented as this, sudden eruption of sexual liberation. But the roots of her rebellious nature, they're actually found in an incredibly conservative, tightly controlled, and prosperous environment.
Precisely. She was born and raised in Paris's luxurious 16th arrondissement. This was, the bastion of the French bourgeoisie. It was a world of rigid Catholic convention. Her father was an engineer, an industrial factory proprietor. Her maternal grandfather was an insurance director. This was a family of success, of status, and of very, very severe discipline.
And the sources detail a truly pivotal, traumatic incident that seems to have just galvanized her future rebellious streak. It created this deep, permanent reservoir of resentment toward her parents. It wasn't just a distant or chilly environment. There was a specific moment of profound emotional injury.
That moment is absolutely key to understanding her later iconoclasm. Bardot and her younger sister, Mijanu, were playing, and they broke their parents' favorite vase. Now, while the physical punishment was common at the time, her father whipped them 20 times, the emotional response was arguably far more damaging.
Because they were subsequently treated like total outsiders in their own home.
Yes. Her father demanded that they address their parents using the formal distancing French pronoun vous rather than the familiar tu.
And for anyone who doesn't speak French, can you explain why that's so significant?
Well, in French culture, using vous within your immediate family is profoundly cold. It's reserved for strangers, for the elderly, or people of higher status. It was a calculated, devastating psychological tool designed to enforce distance and obedience.
So if we just pause on that for a second, that punishment is a perfect microcosm of her lifelong struggle. It basically trained her from a very young age to resent formality, hierarchy, and any institution that tried to impose emotional constraint. She spent the rest of her life rejecting the vous of authority.
That's a brilliant way to put it. That trauma absolutely fuels the intense need for personal, immediate freedom that defines both her screen persona and her later activism.
She needed an outlet.
She needed an outlet. And amidst this rigidity, her mother encouraged her natural inclination toward dance, particularly during World War II when social activities were limited.
So dance, which requires absolute physical control, paradoxically becomes her first taste of personal agency, her path out.
Absolutely. And that talent was refined, leading to a huge step in 1949 when she was accepted into the prestigious Conservatoire de Paris. She trained rigorously for 3 years under the renowned Russian choreographer Boris Nazev. This early discipline shows you that her later wildness was founded on deep training and focus.
But the shift from diligent ballerina to public figure, it kind of bypassed the stage and went straight into publishing and celebrity culture.
It did. Helene Gordon-Lazareff, who was the director of 2 major magazines, Elle and Le Jardin des Modes, hired the young Bardot as a junior fashion model in 1949.
And that's where the visibility just exploded.
It really did. Just a year later, at age 15, on March 8, 1950, Bardot appeared on the cover of Elle. And that cover was magnetic. It led directly to an acting audition for the director, Marc Allegret.
She didn't get the role, but she did meet the man who would guide her initial career and become her first husband, Roger Vadim.
And their connection was immediate and intense, but her parents were fiercely opposed. She was still just a teenager, and this relationship with an older man like Vadim was deemed scandalous in their conservative social circle.
The opposition was so strong, her father actually bought her a train ticket, intending to send her away to England to finish her education and just break up the relationship.
Yes, and this confrontation pushed Bardot to an extreme reaction, which really demonstrates that all-or-nothing intensity that would mark her entire life.
This is a pretty dramatic story.
The sources confirm the dramatic escalation. She threatened suicide, specifically by putting her head into an oven. It was a horrifying, desperate act.
Wow.
Her parents intervened just in time, but the crisis forced a complete capitulation from them. They accepted the relationship, but only under one condition. She had to wait until she turned 18 to marry Vadim.
So she marries him in 1952, and the professional career begins almost instantly. Her first paid film role was a small part in the 1952 comedy Crazy for Love, which earned her 200,000 francs. What was that in real terms at the time?
It was about $575, so certainly not superstar money, but it was a foot in the door.
A start.
A start. And critically, her subsequent roles immediately started to define her public image. Her second role was in Menina, the Girl in the Bikini, from 1952.
The title really says it all. This is where she began the global popularization of the bikini, an item of clothing that had only recently been invented and was still seen as highly controversial. I mean, it was banned on some European beaches, let alone in the U.S.
And this notoriety was just amplified when she arrived at the 1953 Cannes Film Festival. She was photographed extensively in the new swimwear, deliberately courting attention and scandal. She was effectively establishing herself as a symbol of unapologetic sexuality before she was even 20.
And before she became the definitive global blonde, she was actually still brunette in these early roles.
That aesthetic shift, which was purely accidental, became indispensable to her image. While she was shooting the Italian film Nero's Weekend in 1956, the director asked the brunette Bardot to appear as a blonde for a scene. And rather than wear a temporary wig, she just opted to dye her hair. She loved the result, that sun-kissed, natural yet glamorous blonde, and chose to retain the color permanently. That blonde hair became inseparable from the global BB image, marking the final stage of her transformation into the icon.
Okay, so the blonde transformation coincided perfectly with the seismic event that launched her from a French starlet to a true international superstar. The 1956 film, And God Created Woman.
This was the moment everything changed. It was Roger Vadim's directorial debut, filmed in Saint-Tropez, and it featured Bardot as Juliette, an immoral teenager who is free-spirited, unapologetically sexual, and totally indifferent to social constraint.
A perfect artistic mirror of Bardot's own rebellious nature.
Exactly, and the film's success was astronomical, especially in the United States. It became the highest-grossing foreign film ever released up to that point, pulling in a staggering $4 million. And that success was entirely fueled by scandal.
The film scandalized conservative America. Its themes of overt female sexuality and non-monogamy were just unheard of in mainstream cinema.
It was so controversial that theater managers screening it in some U.S. cities were actually arrested on obscenity charges.
Wow.
This reaction solidified her defining nickname, the Sex Kitten.
I think the key point here is the timeliness of her arrival. She arrived exactly when the post-war culture was ready to shed its constraints, but lacked a visual symbol for that freedom.
That's exactly what the sources highlight. The Life magazine journalist Paul O'Neill wrote in 1958 that Bardot's timing on the American scene was just immaculate. The U.S. public was, and I quote, hungry for something racier and more realistic than the familiar domestic product.
Right, because American actresses of the time were largely confined to roles as wives, sweethearts, or maybe cautious rebels. Bardot was raw, sun-soaked, and utterly indifferent to being liked.
Totally indifferent. But the most important stamp of approval didn't come from Hollywood. It came from the French intellectual elite. In 1959, the philosopher Simone de Beauvoir, a giant of 20th century feminist thought, wrote the famous essay The Lolita Syndrome, entirely about Bardot.
And this is where the analysis moves beyond mere celebrity. De Beauvoir's validation elevated Bardot from a sex symbol to a social theory.
It absolutely did. De Beauvoir declared her the most liberated woman of France and, critically, a locomotive of women's history.
What does de Beauvoir mean by that locomotive comment? It implies she wasn't following history, she was dragging it forward.
She was dragging it forward just by existing. De Beauvoir argued that the traditional female path required women to be either virginal or maternal, trapped in domesticity. Bardot defied this by embodying existential freedom. She was a woman who was fully present, fully sexual, and defined entirely by her own choices, not by her relationship to a man or her role in society. She was a natural being, not a manufactured social product. This essay provided the intellectual context necessary for the world to take her seriously as a cultural force, not just a physical one.
And commercially, that intellectual validation translated into massive earnings. By 1958, Bardot was officially the highest-paid actress in France.
And she used that leverage. We see her continuing to deliver huge hits, demonstrating her ability to carry a film regardless of the genre. Naughty Girl in 50 Seidel, co-written by Vadim, was a hit. Babette Goes to War in 59, a comedy set during World War II, was the fourth biggest movie of the year in France.
But her biggest success in France, and a film that gave her genuine acting credibility, was the intense courtroom drama, The Truth, from 1960, directed by Henri-Georges Clouzot.
This film was meticulously publicized and critically acclaimed. It earned her the 1961 David Di Donatello Award for Best Foreign Actress and received an Academy Award nomination for Best Foreign Film. It proved she had commercial appeal far beyond those sunny Saint-Tropez melodramas.
But that production was famously grueling, right? And the intensity led directly to personal upheaval.
It did. Because even as she was professionalizing her celebrity, her private life was a constant source of stress and drama. The chaos of her relationships ran parallel to her professional ascent.
Right.
The source material shows this relentless cycle of intense connection and painful detachment. Her relationship with her and God-created woman co-star Jean-Louis Trintignant complicated her marriage to Vadim, which led to their divorce in 1957. Bardot and Trintignant lived together, but his mandatory military service often separated them, creating a lot of strain.
And during one of those separations, she had an affair with the musician Gilbert Bécaud, which effectively ended the Trintignant relationship.
And the emotional fallout was severe. Following the final breakup with Trintignant in early 1958, she suffered a reported nervous breakdown while she was in Italy. The sources confirm a subsequent, though denied, suicide attempt involving sleeping pills. She recovered within several weeks, but it just shows. She was a woman of extremes, professionally successful but emotionally volatile, constantly seeking an authenticity that seemed to escape her grasp.
Moving into the early 1960s, we see Bardot deliberately attempting to shed that pure sex kitten label. She starts diversifying her film choices and working with the giants of the French New Wave.
This era is so crucial for her legacy because it shows her commitment to high art, not just commercial success. Louis Malle's 1962 film, A Very Private Affair, was semi-autobiographical, explicitly inspired by the intense, suffocating scrutiny of her own life.
And perhaps more importantly, she partnered with Jean-Luc Godard, arguably the most important director of the French New Wave. Not just once, but twice.
That's enormous validation. She starred in the critically revered Le Mépris, or Contempt, in 1963, which is this meta-commentary on filmmaking and relationships. She also made a cameo in his 1966 film Masculine Feminine. By working with directors like Malle and Godard, she demonstrated she was more than just a pinup. She was a serious cultural collaborator.
Of course, the inevitable calls from Hollywood came, seeking to harness her bankability. But her attempts to fully crack the American market were, well, largely underwhelming.
Yes, she made two significant attempts. The first was a brief, almost cameo appearance in Dear Brigitte in 1965 with James Stewart, which didn't really resonate with audiences. Then came the ambitious Western, Shalako, in 1968, co-starring Sean Connery, who was riding high on his James Bond fame.
But Shalako failed commercially, and the experience seems to have solidified her commitment to staying in France.
It did. And it's an interesting little anecdote that she reportedly rejected Connery's advances during the filming. She later joked that she wasn't a James Bond girl, suggesting a rejection of the mainstream manufactured glamour that Hollywood represented. She just preferred the messy existential freedom of French cinema.
However, she proved she could still deliver global commercial dynamite when paired correctly. Viva Maria, from 1965, where she starred alongside fellow French icon Jeanne Moreau, was a major worldwide hit.
That film was massive. It cemented her place as a major cinematic force globally and earned her a BAFTA nomination for Best Foreign Actress. She was proving time and again that she could define the era on her own terms.
Now, her music career often gets treated as a footnote, but it was actually prolific and surprisingly experimental.
Yeah.
She recorded over 60 songs, partnering with major figures, most notably Serge Gainsbourg, but also Bob Zagary and Sacha Distel.
And these weren't just novelty songs. Tracks like Harley Davidson, Llama Drug, and Contact were huge hits across Europe. But the story that really defines her musical career involves one of the most infamously scandalous duets ever recorded. Je t'aime moi non plus.
Okay, let's really get into the dynamic surrounding this. Bardot recorded the original version of this duet with Gainsbourg, but the track was so overtly sensual, including breathy moans and simulated intimacy, that she immediately worried about the impending scandal.
She was absolutely terrified of the potential cultural backlash, which is, ironic considering her reputation. She pleaded with Gainsbourg not to release it. He had a deep respect for her, and he complied. He shelved the original version entirely.
And then he went on to record and release the now iconic version with his new partner Jane Birkin the following year.
Right. And that Birkin-Gainsbourg track, of course, became a massive hit and was banned by radio stations all across Europe, further cementing its scandalous reputation.
But what's fascinating is that Bardot's original, more explosive version didn't officially see the light of day until 1986, long after she had retired from public performance.
Yeah, but in a sign of her enduring power, when Universal Music released its back catalog online in 2006, Bardot's version suddenly became a major, globally downloaded hit. Her influence spans decades, even when the material itself is decades old.
And politically, before her grand exit, France made this profound gesture of acceptance toward her wildness. From 1969 to 1972, Bardot served as the official face of Marianne, the symbol of the French Republic.
I mean, think about the symbolism of that. The sex kitten literally replaced the previously anonymous effigy to become the face of French liberty, reason, and nationhood. It was a formal acknowledgement that the rebellious youth culture she symbolized had become mainstream, patriotic even.
Yet, by 1973, at the relatively young age of 39, she decided she was done. She made her final film with Vadim Don Juan, or If Don Juan Were a Woman, in which she played the title male role. And Vadim noted that the production felt like the end of something for their shared creative journey.
She followed that with one last film, the edifying and joyous story of Colonna, and then she was simply gone. Her explanation for retiring was perfectly Bardot. She called it a way to get out elegantly. She just walked away from the relentless pressure of being an icon, choosing self-determination over continued stardom.
So she retires from the stage in 1973, seeking a quieter existence, but the private life she sought to protect remained far more dramatic than any script she ever touched. When you look at her history, the sheer number of relationships she had is just striking.
It speaks to her restless nature and her constant search for fulfillment and passion. She had 4 marriages: Roger Vadim, Jacques Charrier, the German millionaire Günter Sachs, and her current husband, Bernard Dormal, whom she married in 1992. But her total count of documented romantic relationships tallied 17.
And her personal philosophy on relationships was brutally honest, almost dismissive of stability. She characterized her pattern as leaving when the present was getting lukewarm, and said that the moment passion faded, she was packing my suitcase.
But the greatest complexity, and arguably the most damaging chapter of her personal history, centers on the intensely negative experience of her only pregnancy with Jacques Charrier. This is a crucial area to examine because it shows the profound and tragic gap between her public image as a liberated woman and her private distress.
She was unequivocal about her lack of desire for motherhood. She stated directly in her memoirs, "I am not a mother, nor do I want to be one." But since abortion was illegal in France at the time, she felt completely trapped by the pregnancy.
And the sources reveal real desperation. She attempted repeated, dangerous measures to end the pregnancy herself, including punching herself in the stomach and repeatedly requesting morphine from her doctor, hoping for a miscarriage. This just illustrates a woman pushed to the very edge of her physical and psychological limits by societal constraints she usually brushed aside.
Nicolas Jacques Charrier was born on January 11, 1960, and the intense media surveillance surrounding her property in Saint-Tropez was so overwhelming that she decided to give birth at home simply to escape the paparazzi.
The aftermath was severe. It resulted in profound depression. Following his birth, she attempted suicide. And when you read her own reflections on the experience, which she published later in her 1996 memoir, Initiales Bibi, the language is genuinely shocking.
The phrases she used were deeply hurtful, directed at the one person she was supposed to cherish.
She wrote that her son was a cancerous tumor and that she would have preferred to give birth to a little dog. Now, we have to remember the context of that shock because she later tried to explain the comments, saying, "I'm not made to be a mother, I'm not adult enough," but the immediate rejection was also physical. She refused to breastfeed Nicholas, and the child reportedly sensed her deep agitation when she held him and would start to cry immediately.
This sounds like a just heartbreaking situation fueled by deep emotional immaturity on her part and a profound inability to cope with an unwanted situation.
It was. And when she divorced Cherry, he gained sole custody, and the damage was lasting. The final rupture came years later when Nicolas Jacques and Jacques Charrier jointly sued her and her publisher in 1997 for those incredibly hurtful remarks published in the memoir.
And the court agreed that the language was defamatory and cruel.
They won a significant victory. She was ordered to pay Charrier £17,000 and Nicholas £11,000 in fines. Her relationship with her son remained deeply strained for decades. She wasn't even invited to his wedding in 1984. The legal action solidified the distance she herself had created.
However, the source material does offer a small measure of healing. As of recent reports from 2018, she and Nicholas, who is now a grandfather himself, are reportedly on good terms. They speak regularly and visit once a year. It speaks to the slow, difficult process of attempting to reconcile a lifetime of regret and complexity.
And shifting briefly to her material wealth, despite walking away from her lucrative film career early, Bardot has maintained significant financial independence. Her estimated net worth hovers around $65 million, and it's worth noting she made about $4 million just from that controversial 1997 memoir.
She also retained ownership of the properties that became synonymous with her image. She owned Le Castellet, a massive 14-bedroom villa in Cannes, which she listed for sale recently in 2020. But she still resides at La Madrague in Saint-Cyr-sur-Mer, which she bought back in 1958 and where she retreated after retirement.
And that retreat speaks to her lifelong defiance of convention, a final anecdote that links her personal life to that rebellious streak. She was officially awarded the Legion of Honor in 1985, one of France's highest distinctions, but famously refused to attend the ceremony and declined the award. This move put her in the company of other iconoclasts like Sartre and Camus, further solidifying her rejection of institutional recognition. She will not be constrained, even by accolades.
Okay, so when she retired in 1973, she didn't embrace a quiet life. She simply redirected that formidable, all-consuming passion. She pivoted completely from performing for human audiences to protecting animals, becoming a vegetarian, and focusing her immense energy on welfare.
This transition was total and immediate. In 1986, she founded the Brigitte Bardot Foundation for the welfare and protection of animals. And to guarantee its funding, she didn't just rely on donations. She auctioned off her own personal belongings, her jewelry, items from her films.
That's a huge sacrifice for an icon who, relies on her possessions and her image. How much did that initial auction raise?
It raised 3 million francs, which was approximately $430,000 in 1986. That provided the seed funding for the foundation, demonstrating her absolute commitment. And the establishment has recognized her dedication, too. She's a member of the UN Environment Programme's Global 500 Roll of Honor and received a PETA Humanitarian Award in 2001.
And her early direct action campaigns were dramatic and instantly globalized because of her celebrity.
Absolutely. One of the most famous actions occurred in 1977 when she met Paul Watson, the founder of the Sea Shepherd Conservation Society. She joined his operation, condemning the massacre of seal pups on Canadian ice floes. Critically, the photos of Bardot posing with the seal pups circulated worldwide. Her presence gave the issue instantaneous, unprecedented global attention.
Her campaigns have been varied. She strongly opposed horse meat consumption in France, going so far as issuing death threats in 1994, though the sources do indicate she was responding defensively to threats she herself had received.
And she has dedicated huge resources to practical aid, not just public protests. For example, she funded a mass sterilization and adoption program for Bucharest's estimated 300,000 stray dogs, donating over $140,000 over 2 years starting in 2001. Her recent activity shows no decrease in intensity. Just this year, in 2024, she appealed directly to President Macron to grant political asylum to Paul Watson, demonstrating her continued willingness to engage politically on animal issues.
Which brings us to the core contradiction that defines her later life. We have this globally respected animal rights warrior, but she's also a deeply controversial political figure, having been convicted, 6 times for inciting racial hatred as of November 2021.
This is critical context for understanding the isolated, defiant figure she became, and we have to report these facts impartially. Her legal troubles frequently stem from the collusion between her passion for animal welfare and her strong anti-immigrant, far-right political views, particularly concerning the ritual slaughter of animals.
So let's detail some of those convictions for the listener, providing the necessary context. The controversy first gained major traction with her 1999 book, Le Carré de Pluton.
Correct. In that book, she criticized the ritual slaughter of sheep during the Islamic holiday of Eid al-Adha. But the critical context came in a section titled Open Letter to My Lost France, where she stated that her country was, quote, again invaded by an overpopulation of foreigners, especially Muslims.
And what was the immediate legal consequence of that?
A French court fined her 30,000 francs in 2000 for that specific comment. And the sources indicate that by this point, she had already been fined twice before for similar public remarks in the late 90s. The fines really underscore the seriousness with which French courts view violations of laws against inciting racial hatred.
Her defiance continued into the 2000s, targeting major political figures. In 2008, she was convicted and fined 15,000 euros for a letter she sent to Nicolas Sarkozy.
That letter was initially about religious slaughter practices, specifically her objections to the killing of sheep without anesthesia. But in that same letter, referring to the Muslim population, she dramatically declared that she was, quote, fed up with being under the thumb of this population which is destroying us, destroying our country, and imposing its habits.
And the prosecutors at the time made a point of stating their weariness with having to charge her repeatedly with racial hatred offenses. She was simply unwilling to modify her language or public stance.
Her largest fine came much later, in 2021. This followed a highly controversial 2019 open letter concerning animal cruelty on the French island of Réunion. In that letter, she called the inhabitants autochthones who have kept the genes of savages, and shockingly referenced reminiscences of cannibalism.
That language resulted in a conviction on November 4th, 2021, and her largest fine to date, 20,000 euros. It just shows that even in her late 80s, her willingness to use inflammatory, politically charged language remains absolute.
And it wasn't just human targets. That same year, she was fined for insulting hunters, calling them submen and drunkards who carried genes of cruel barbarism. Her insults are consistent. She uses language intended to delegitimize the humanity of anyone she views as an opponent to her core cause.
And this political stance is reflected in her formal affiliations. She supports the far-right National Rally Party. For those unfamiliar with French politics, this is a party historically associated with strong anti-immigration and nationalist sentiments.
And her husband, Bernard Dormal, is a former advisor to Jean-Marie Le Pen, the party's founder. Bardot has openly endorsed the current leader, Marine Le Pen, going so far as calling her the Joan of Arc of the 21st century. This positions her firmly on the political fringe, completing her lifelong rejection of the French establishment that once adored her.
And even her recent public appearances maintain this posture against modern social discourse. In a major television interview in May 2025, her first in over a decade, she continued her iconoclastic attack on accepted social norms, particularly around feminism and harassment.
She stated quite plainly, "Feminism isn't my thing. I like guys." And she went on to defend talented people who grab a girl's buttocks, suggesting that society shouldn't simply cancel people for such behavior. This demonstrates a consistent pattern. Whether it's the rigid codes of the 1950s or the new social constraints of the 2020s, Bardot finds something to defy.
Despite the volatility of her later life and the intensity of her legal battles, the initial impact of Bibi is absolutely impossible to overstate. She didn't just model fashion, she revolutionized it.
She is a definitive timeless style icon, serving as a muse for designers like Dior, Balmain, and Pierre Cardin. We still use her name today to describe an iconic look. The Bardot neckline.
That wide-open neck that exposes both shoulders, a classic symbol of effortless sensuality. is named after her due to her popularization of the style on screen and in photographs. It's a key piece of her legacy.
And then there's the bikini. While she didn't invent it, she single-handedly launched it into mainstream acceptability. Her photographs at the 1953 Cannes Film Festival and her early film role in Menina, the girl in the bikini, made it a cultural phenomenon. She was key to taking the bikini from a scandalous fashion statement to a universally accepted piece of beachwear.
She also brought specific French domestic trends to global prominence, like the choucroute hairstyle, a large, voluminous style similar to the beehive.
And crucially, gingham clothes. After she wore a simple, checkered pink dress by Jacques Estorel to her wedding with Jacques Charrier, gingham became instantly fashionable worldwide. She defined a look that was casual, effortlessly sensual, and provocatively feminine, a stark contrast to the highly stylized, controlled glamour of Hollywood.
Her status as a muse transcended France and even fashion. Her third husband, Gunter Sachs, commissioned 8 Andy Warhol paintings of her in 1974.
And her appeal to musicians was equally vast. Bob Dylan, for example, dedicated the very first song he ever wrote to Bardot. He also mentions her by name in his track, I Shall Be Free. She represented the ultimate, unattainable European bohemian dream for these American artists.
Even the Beatles were swept up. John Lennon and Paul McCartney once planned to shoot an entire film featuring the Beatles and Bardot, though it never materialized. Lennon did finally meet her once in 1968, but his recollection suggests a moment of cultural burnout. I was on acid and she was on her way out.
Beyond the fashion and art, her visual identity created a new form of iconography. The enduring power of the Bardot pose, that famous modeling portrait shot around 1960 where she is dressed only in black pantyhose, cross-legged and cross-armed, has been emulated endlessly by modern celebrities, including Lindsay Lohan and Rihanna. It captures her unique blend of vulnerability and defiance.
She also had a measurable economic and cultural impact on geography itself, what we might call the Bardot effect. She is singularly credited with popularizing the small fishing village of Saint-Tropez in France, turning it into the global playground for the rich and famous we know today, simply by choosing to live and film there.
And she had the same effect on the other side of the world. She popularized Armação dos Buzios in Brazil, which she visited in 1964 with her boyfriend at the time, Bob Zagari. That town today acknowledges her impact directly, hosting a statue of her by Cristina Mota. That is true cultural power-making, 2 obscure locations, global destinations, simply by visiting them.
It's clear that her influence is profoundly visible in modern celebrities who have consciously adopted her aesthetic, including Kylie Minogue, Claudia Schiffer, and Scarlett Johansson. But true to her iconoclastic form, Bardot is confident that they only scratch the surface.
She remains fiercely confident in her unique status, stating simply and accurately, "None have my personality." And the attention hasn't stopped. Her enduring and deeply complex story was the focus of the 2023 French drama TV series Bardot, which brought her narrative to a new generation.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Brigitte Bardot's journey is a spectacular case study of the power and often the immense psychological burden of achieving such profound icon status. She began as the carefully managed daughter of a severe bourgeois family, exploded into the global symbol of sexual and existential liberation, and eventually channeled that foundational need for defiance into an isolated, legally contentious voice for animal protection.
She traded the constraints of constantly having to be the global sex kitten, managed by handlers and studios, for the freedom of absolute outspokenness, regardless of the consequences to her public adoration or her legal peace. It suggests a deep, fundamental, perhaps unhealable need for control and authenticity, rooted in that childhood trauma that neither fame, fortune, nor the French establishment could ever truly satisfy.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. If we go back to that pivotal year of 1973, consider the timing of her retirement. Did stepping away from the demands of being the cultural icon genuinely save her, offering her a path to self-fulfillment through activism? Or did it merely redirect that formidable, all-consuming passion into a new, equally extreme, equally public form of engagement, a far-right activist, ultimately ensuring her continued role as France's most compelling and controversial export, unable ever to escape the public stage? Something for you to mull over as you dive back into your own world.